Hi, my name is Todd Carter. I'm a Principal Premier Field Engineer working for Microsoft. In this module, we will go over the new workflow capabilities of SharePoint 2010 and the tools that are used to author these workflows. We'll begin by providing an overview of what's new in SharePoint 2010 workflows from various user perspectives. We then introduce you to several tools which can be used to design, create, and extend workflows, starting with a look at the new SharePoint workflow template built into Visio 2010. SharePoint Designer 2010's Workflow Designer has been totally redesigned to allow for authoring of more complex workflows. The designer addresses many of the challenges users had when creating workflows in SharePoint Designer 2007. We then end the module with a discussion on extending workflows within Visual Studio 2010 using the new Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint Developer Tools. So let's begin by talking about what's new for users, power users, and developers when working with SharePoint 2010 workflow. For end users, we have new targets for workflow associations. Specifically, we can now create workflows which no longer have to be associated with a list or a content type. These workflows are known as site workflows and can be used in cases where there may not be any need to track or use list data within the workflow. We also have a new way to visualize the process or progress of running workflows with Visio visualization. This is where we use Visio services to create a Visio diagram of a running workflow and denote the path and the current step of the workflow. For power users, we have a much improved designer within SharePoint Designer 2010, which supports more complex workflow scenarios, including nested logic. We can then export these workflows and reuse them across any number of site collections. Combined with sandbox solutions, which we will cover in other Ignite modules, a power user can build a workflow in SharePoint Designer and provide that workflow in a WSP package to other site collection administrators for them to use within their site collections. A new task designer process allows for the creation of workflows which have complex task processing needs, such as escalation and parallel operations. Being able to customize the out-of-the-box workflows is another alternative available to those users who only want to modify a very small portion of these workflows. With InfoPath 2010 integration built right into SharePoint, we can create no-code InfoPath-based instantiation and association forms. And finally, Visio 2010 adds the ability to design and model SharePoint workflows, which are imported into SharePoint Designer for further development. For the developer, the new Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint Developer Tools make creating SharePoint workflows even easier. The developer can begin with a new workflow project or may choose to import a workflow created within SharePoint Designer as a starting point. Workflow events allow the developer to hook certain workflow events much like they can today with list events. A new pluggable external data exchange service model has been added that allow for the external execution of dependent tasks to operate and complete outside of SharePoint. It's important to note that workflows created within SharePoint 2010 run as .NET Framework 3.5 SP1 workflows, and we currently do not support .NET 4.0 Framework workflows. Throughout this module, I will take you through an example where we will begin modeling a simple workflow in Visio 2010. We will then move that model into SharePoint Designer, where we will wire up additional activities necessary for the workflow to operate. Then in our last demo, we will use Visual Studio 2010 to add a custom external data exchange service, which will simulate calling into a vendor system to order a product. This walkthrough takes the workflow from creation using Visio 2010 and importing that workflow into SharePoint Designer. It's important to note that when the workflow is still in SharePoint Designer, it can be exported and re-imported within Visio 2010 at any time. This, however, is not the case once the workflow is imported into Visual Studio 2010. This transition is a one-way activity, and there is no method to export Visual Studio-based workflows back into SharePoint Designer. So let's start with Visio 2010. Visio ships with a new SharePoint workflow template. This template allows business users who may be familiar with business processes but who may not have the knowledge of SharePoint workflows to model their processes. These templates can then be exported into SharePoint Designer and further extended. Visio offers shapes which represent each activity you will find in SharePoint Designer 2010. The Visio user, however, will not need to concern themselves with how to configure each activity, but rather can remain focused on the process flow and logic of the workflow. Another feature of SharePoint 2010 workflows is Visio visualization. This feature allows users to visualize their workflow while it's in flight using Visio services. So let's start with an example. In our first of 3 demos, we will start the process of modeling a workflow using Visio 2010. Hello, in this demo we're going to create a SharePoint workflow using Visio 2010. We're going to actually, this is the first of 3 demos we're going to do in this module. The first demo we're going to do is creating a workflow in Visio. We're then going to export that workflow out of Visio. The next demo we're going to do is for SharePoint Designer. We're going to actually import that Visio created workflow into SharePoint Designer, modify it, and then execute it within SharePoint. Then the third demo we're going to do is take that workflow that was created originally in Visio, then in SharePoint Designer. We're going to export that and import that into Visual Studio, add some additional functionality, and then deploy that and have a fully functional workflow for SharePoint that originated in Visio, and we ended up completing it over in Visual Studio 2010. So this is the first part of the demo. The demo is really going to be formatted around this My Products list that we had previously in previous modules. And what this is supposed to represent potentially an inventory of products that we have. So we have our product name, our cost, the price, the amount on hand, just the profit, and then we have the default order amount. So whenever we run out of one of these products, this is the amount that we would order, and then whether the product's discontinued or not. So we wouldn't necessarily order that product if it was discontinued. So the workflow that we want to create is to be executed when one of these products, we actually run out of one of these products. In other words, the amount on hand goes to 0. We want to go ahead and kick off an email notification letting people know, hey, by the way, we're out of product. And then we also want to kick off a workflow, kick off some activity where the actual product is ordered from a vendor, potentially a third-party vendor. It orders that product, and then we receive that order back. We're able to then update our list item with the new amount that we received. So let's start off with inside of Visio. And we have this new SharePoint workflow type. It's going to be located under flowchart, and under Microsoft SharePoint Workflow is where this is found. Now, when this opens up, what you'll find is over here on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, we have these SharePoint Workflow actions, and these all represent actions or activities that actually are available to us in SharePoint Designer. So we can start by creating a workflow, but is dragging and dropping various bits of workflow, various items onto the design surface here. So what we want to do is we want to just go ahead and jump to creating a workflow. Probably you always want to start and you always want to terminate workflow item. Let's go ahead and make this a little larger. You guys can see it okay on the video. There we are. Now, for our scenario, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we do something if we're out of product. If we're not, we don't really have anything to do. So you can think about this workflow is going to be kicked off in 2 different cases. One, when one of those items changes, or 2, when we create a brand new product and we want to kick off this workflow as well. So let's just take a compare data source. So this is the case where we want to compare whether we have a product available or not. So we want to use a connector. Now, I'll go ahead and connect this over here, this other end, to the terminator. So compare data source. So we're going to just put in something like, are we out of product? Well, we're going to select no here. And we're going to do another compare data source, right? Because we don't want to order the product if it's been discontinued. So is product discontinued? So what we want to do is we want to attach, we want to continue on. Let's say let's say the product is, we are out of product and the product is discontinued. What do we want to do? We want to maybe send some email to some folks and let them know that we are out of a discontinued product and we won't be receiving any more. So let's go ahead and send some mail. So we might send an email. Send discontinued email, and we'll go ahead and jump over here, and then when we're done sending that mail, we can just go ahead and terminate the process. Now, a couple things here. Whenever you have these decision boxes, you need to make sure you label these yes and no. Now, what will happen is whenever you try to export this, the workflow will be validated. So if you happen to have missed one, it will tell you. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and leave one of those blank just so I can show you what that looks like. Just going to move that over a little bit. Let's go ahead and send another mail down here. We're going to send an out of product email. So we just let everybody know that, hey, we're out of a product and we're just going to be ordering it. And we'll go ahead and say no, hasn't been discontinued. So what we want to do at this point is we want to potentially add some additional, we want to actually order the product at this point. However, we don't really have an activity for that. That's kind of an advanced activity that we're going to be building later on. So what we'll do right now is just log to the history list. We'll log something like order product from vendor. And we'll go ahead and connect these guys. And then once the product's been ordered from the vendor, we're done. We can go ahead and end the workflow. So this is something that maybe a user familiar with the business, familiar with how this works, would generate a workflow similar to this. Let's go ahead and save this workflow. Now let me go ahead and attempt to export this workflow. So underneath the Process tab, we have an Export Workflow. And what it's going to do is going to tell us that we have some issues. Please resolve the issues. So I said, okay. It's going to pop up and it's going to tell me here that I've got a shape that doesn't have a label. So we need to go ahead and fix that. And this is that issue I was telling you about before. So over here, are we out of product? Yes. So everything else looks fine. Save it one more time. I'll export. And this time it lets me export. So we'll call this out of product. Now notice it's going to create this Visio workflow interchange file format for us. And this is what's going to allow us to import this into SharePoint Designer. Whoops. Actually, I selected the wrong. I want to export. There we go. Out of product. Okay, so it's been saved. So we've created our workflow and we've exported it, so now it can be sent over to somebody that's running SharePoint Designer. It's more familiar with how to build those workflows. But this is the experience of your users that are used to probably working inside of Visio. They can now create these SharePoint workflows that are then can be imported into SharePoint Designer and then built and extended upon. So what you will notice is that, like for example, out of product, we didn't specify how you determine if we're out of product. We didn't specify how you determine if your product's been discontinued, or what email is going to look like, or what, you know, who we're going to send the email to. So these are things that that's really more of an engineering task, and so that's why we don't really actually do that here inside of Visio. So that's just something to note. So that's going to end this demo. In this next section, I'll introduce you to some of the new features used to create workflows in SharePoint Designer 2010. SharePoint Designer has undergone a major change. As an application, SharePoint Designer is much more focused on SharePoint with a new UI. The new workflow capabilities of SharePoint Designer will often negate or reduce the need for Visual Studio 2010. When you have requirements that need custom development, SharePoint Designer is an awesome tool to prototype a workflow before taking it into Visual Studio, especially combined with using Visio as a starting point. As I will show you in the next demo, SharePoint Designer has a new declarative workflow designer, which moves away from the wizard-style designer found in SharePoint Designer 2007. We will discuss the new types of workflows and the new actions and task process designer, which greatly improve your ability to create fully functional workflows within SharePoint Designer. We will also show you Visio visualization in action and discuss the support for sandbox custom activities, which allow additional activities to be deployed within SharePoint and leveraged within SharePoint Designer when creating workflows. The Workflow Designer is completely overhauled. By making use of the ribbon, a more natural feel to the authoring of workflows is provided. Users of the existing SharePoint Designer 2007 product will have little difficulty applying what they know of authoring workflows. The new full-screen Workflow Designer allows users to insert actions or conditions directly into insertion points within the designer by either selecting the items from the menu or typing part of the name and searching for the item. Note, the new designer still creates sequential workflows, and that there have been other investments in the field of creating workflows heavy on human interaction. It's also important to understand the new designer does not break any existing workflow investments you may have made, and does not modify your existing workflows, which have been previously upgraded or which are currently still in use today. The tooling improvements built into SharePoint Designer allow for the construction of more complex workflows, which mirror more realistic real-world business processes, including nested logic and parallel blocks of execution. Personation steps allow the workflow to run as the author of the workflow rather than the person initializing the workflow, to allow the workflow to perform steps which certain users of the workflow may not have permission. SharePoint Designer allows a workflow author the ability to add additional columns to a list to support necessary workflow operations without having to leave SharePoint Designer. With the new manager and user profile property lookups, it becomes easier, for example, to assign a task to a current user's manager without any custom coding. New actions have been added to help with record management and document set management. And with the ability to read and write to external lists, this allows your line of business data to be leveraged within SharePoint workflows. Because not all workflow projects may start or end as SharePoint workflows, the ability to import and export the new Visio 2010 workflow format is supported, as well as the ability to export the workflow into a WSP solution, which can then be imported and customized further within Visual Studio 2010 is available. Like in previous versions of SharePoint Designer, a list workflow remains front and center as a supported association for workflows. These workflows, however, do remain locked to the list within the site where they were created and therefore lack portability across site collections. Reusable workflows, however, do not have this limitation and allow the workflow to be exported and reused within other site collections across the current SharePoint installation or within other deployments across an organization. These workflows are exported as WSP solution packages and contain a built-in feature which allows them to be deployed into solution galleries of other site collections and activated. Both SharePoint Designer and Visual Studio support the creation of reusable workflows. Site workflows, like reusable workflows, are a new concept in SharePoint 2010. Site workflows can be used for cases where there may be no requirement to associate a workflow with a list or a content type. For example, if a user wanted to start a workflow and request access to a certain section of the site, the workflow could be initiated and providing a link button, or which navigates the user to the workflow's initialization form, or object model code could be written which kicks off the workflow. SharePoint Designer includes many new actions which can be grouped really into 6 categories. Core actions are common actions which have been used to build SharePoint workflows for years. Document set actions allow activities to be scoped to entire sets of documents. List actions perform activities on items stored within SharePoint List, including external lists. Relational actions allow the workflow author to include various data lookups, which are required for workflow processing. There are also a number of utility actions, such as substring operations and other data analysis, which are sometimes required. Task actions support such as start approval and assign a to-do task, allow the workflow author to use the new Task Process Designer to further configure the workflow. The Task Process Designer can be used to create robust workflow processes, such as approval of 50% of the respondents agree, or escalate a task to a user's manager if the user is not responsive. Tasks can be managed as a group or individually, allowing for a very flexible design experience. Another feature which most users will find interesting is the Visio visualization of running workflows as Visio documents. Users can quickly see the path a workflow has taken and see which activities have been executed or which are currently executing. It's important to note that Visio visualization is only available for SharePoint Designer workflows. In the previous version of SharePoint, custom activities could be developed and deployed that would allow workflow authors to extend the capabilities of the workflows they create. These custom activities, however, had to be deployed as farm-level or full trust solutions, which was not always possible given IT restrictions. SharePoint 2010 allows custom activities to be built as sandbox solutions within Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint developer tools. These solutions can be deployed into a site collection's solution gallery and leveraged by SharePoint Designer 2010 when working with workflows within that site. All classes which implement built-in SharePoint activities have been marked public, which allows developers to extend or supplement the functionality with their own custom behaviors. At this point, it's time for a second demo, where we will take a workflow we created in Visio and extend it with SharePoint Designer 2010.
Hello, in this demo we're going to continue our scenario where we're building a SharePoint workflow to order products when they run out of inventory. So back on this list where we have our My Products list, again we're going to we have a workflow that we started in Visio that will determine if one of these products happens to be out of stock, which is going to be looking at the amount on hand of 0, and if so, we're going to kick off a workflow so that we order that product from a vendor. So what we want to do is we have our Visio workflow that we created, and we want to import that into SharePoint Designer. So this is the new look and feel of SharePoint Designer, specifically around the workflow. Now we have here we have 3 different types of workflow. We have the list workflow, the reusable workflow, and site workflow. So you think about the list workflow as really as the workflow we had previously in SharePoint Designer, where it's really tied to a list and it's not really reusable outside of the site. We also have reusable workflows that you can create and then export and then use those either inside of, you can export them and import them into Visual Studio 2010, or you can export them and then give them to some other site collection administrator that they can actually import them into their site collection and reuse. We also have these site workflows. These are workflows that are not really tied to a list, but are probably just a workflow that you may want to just to kick off a workflow specific to some activity or some action that happens on the site. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually import a Visio workflow, and that's going to create a reusable workflow for us. We're going to go ahead and browse to where we created that workflow. That's right here, out of product. And it's going to be a reusable workflow. And right now we can select all content types, but in our particular case, the content type we really care about is the product content type that we created earlier. Now here's the workflow as we just imported it. Now a couple things. This is the step name. Probably want to give it some a different name here. It's going to pull it in as some ID and then some number. We can call this just the first step. It's really the first and only step we have in our very simple workflow. Now, notice this are we out of product, and this is the product discontinued in this. So these, notice they're in gray. We can't really edit these guys. Now, where did those come from? Well, if you remember back here in our Visio workflow, this is where the business user, if you will, actually typed in some information on each one of these activities, kind of with just the naming. So that naming actually sticks when we bring that into SharePoint Designer. So just keep that in mind. So in this particular case, are we out of product? Well, what we have is we have this little sentence here that we would need to complete. So if the value, and so the value we want, we'll go and reach out and get the value of the current item, and it's going to be amount on hand. If it equals, and then a certain value, and the value we care about is going to be, actually the value we care about is going to be 0. So we just type in 0 here. Now, is the product discontinued? Again, we're going to check a value, current item, discontinued. We'll test equals. And then is it discontinued? Is it equal to yes? And then we're going to email users based upon that. Also, we're going to email users over here. Otherwise, we're going to email users that we're out of product. So let's go ahead and look at this email users. And we're going to select certain users that we want to send email to. So let's just, we can actually send users, let's say Dan Bacon is the guy we want to send email to. So let him know that we're out of product. And we can just sit there and send an email subject, out of discontinued product. And then just tell them which product. So we can actually use these different builders here to actually build everything we want. So the message and the subject if we choose to. So let's just do we potentially add a lookup. So current item, the title of that item would be the name of the product that we're out of. So then we have this title that we can actually say something like, we just ran so that's kind of neat. So we can actually use these. So what will happen is this will be filled in with the name of the product that we're out of, and we send Dan an email. All right, now let's go ahead and we want to email these users whenever we have a product that we're just temporarily out of. So we can do this. Let's go here. We are currently out of, and then we can just add our lookup here, current item, title, and we probably want to make sure we put this in the right spot. There we go. Let's try this. There we go. Okay. Okay, so we'll just send this to potentially everybody on the site. So we'll just say internet visitors. Everybody that's an internet visitor, we'll send it to them. So this is everybody that's an internet visitor of this site will get this message. Okay, and then this is just a bit of a stub message here. We want to go ahead and add this functionality later in Visual Studio, but for right now, what we're going to do is it's order product from vendor, and so we can just log a certain message about to start ordering product, and and that will actually be logged into the history list. So our workflow pretty much is done. We can save. Now when we save this is saved in the XAML file locally, but it's not actually been sent to SharePoint yet. You actually have to use this publish button to actually send this up to SharePoint. But before we do that, I want to go back over here and look at some properties of the actual workflow itself. So where we were before was under this edit workflow. So we can jump back, edit the workflow, or we can use this navigation and go right back to the properties of the workflow. So one of the other neat things that we have that's new is this workflow visualization on status page. And what this does is it uses Visio services to actually render in Visio, render the workflow and the various steps the workflow goes through to as it progresses through its steps. So we can also come down through here and disable various start options as well. But right now we're just going to make that one change. We'll save this, and then let's go ahead and publish this. Okay, so now it's published, so let's go look at on our site. Let's just wire it up to our list real quick. So we'll go into our list, into workflows. We're going to add a workflow, and we'll choose the workflow we just created. Here's our auto product workflow based upon this content type, and we'll give it a name, and we'll go ahead and hit OK. Now, a couple things before we do that. Let's go ahead and make sure we start this workflow when a new item is created, and we also want to start this workflow when an item is changed. All right, now we can go back to our list, and let's go ahead and let's kick off one of these workflows by just going and taking one of these products and putting it out of stock. So by doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to set the items on hand to 0. Save this. And then our workflow is kicked off. Let's take a look at what's going on here. Now this is some of the this is that visualization I was mentioning before in SharePoint and Visio. So let's take a look. Let this load. Now, what this has done is it's rendered the pretty close to what we had earlier in Visio. A little different in that the lines and the boxes aren't exactly where they were before. However, what you will see though is that the names that were actually placed in the boxes before, like are we out of product and is the product discontinued, are still here. So those did actually get to keep. So our workflow actually looks like we were queued here due to heavy load. So let's see if this thing will refresh. Yes, so you notice our status went to completed. So what you'll find is you find that we get these checkboxes each time a step here or activity is completed. So we went through this path, through here. We obviously went through this path, went through this path, and went this way. So we know the path that the workflow took. Now, if an activity was still in progress, for example, if we were doing a waiting on a specific date or waiting on for a certain duration, you'd have a different the checkbox before the activity that got there would be there, but the activity that's actually doing the waiting, we would have had a different little icon here. It looks like a little waiting or spinning wheel icon would have appeared here, denoting that this activity is actually still running. So just a little bit of really neat stuff that the end users will probably like to see visually what's going on with the workflow. So our workflow is completed. We can actually refresh this. It should show completed. Yes, completed. And what we want to do now is actually order the product with Visual Studio. So we will export this into Visual Studio in the next hands-on lab. In the next demo.
For workflows that require the greatest degree of flexibility and complexity, Visual Studio and more specifically Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint Developer Tool workflows continue to offer the highest degree of customization. Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint Developer Tools add a number of new features and functionality only available to professional developers, which use this tool set. Over the next few slides, we will touch on each of these improvements in more detail. Site and list workflows, both of which are reusable, can be created within Visual Studio, which contains sequential or state machine templates to kick off the development process. It is important to note site workflows require a custom initialization form unless you plan to start the workflow from the object model using SP Workflow Manager. Site workflows do not have list or item activation properties, so care should be taken if you may be reusing code which either relies on or attempts to access these variables. In addition to creating new workflows, Visual Studio 2010 can be used to import workflows created in SharePoint Designer, and we will see an example of this later in our next demo. From SharePoint Designer 2010, our user will choose to save a workflow as a template. SharePoint will generate a new WSP solution file and will add it to the site asset library. Once downloaded from SharePoint, a developer using Visual Studio 2010 can choose to import the WSP by leveraging the Import Reusable Workflow SharePoint project item. Note this project item requires a new project to be created at the time of the import, and workflows cannot be directly imported into an existing SharePoint project. Later, however, the project can be moved or merged into a larger SharePoint solution. Creating ASP.NET workflow forms has always been a complex undertaking. There are many intricate steps you need to take to ensure that your workflow supports the rich features of the SharePoint workflow environment. Many of the settings that a user can configure on any workflow, such as whether it will auto-start on a list item change, need to be persisted through code in the workflow form. The new ASP.NET workflow forms support in Visual Studio 2010 make creating association and instantiation forms much easier. The tools include the ability to easily add ASP.NET association and instantiation forms into your Visual Studio project, which contain code and references needed to leverage these new forms in your workflows with minimal code needed to wire up the forms. SharePoint 2010 now supports workflow event receivers, which work much like list event receivers. These can be scoped to a site, root web, list, or list template. The Visual Studio 2010 SharePoint developer tools have built-in designer support to aid the developer in creating the necessary classes to support workflow event receivers. Workflow event receivers can be used across many scenarios, including starting additional workflows once another workflow completes, or moving workflow history into secondary storage locations. This example shows the 4 workflow events supported by SharePoint 2010. They include workflow starting, which fires just before a workflow begins processing. This receiver is considered a synchronous receiver and supports the option of canceling the workflow before it starts. Other events, such as workflow started, workflow completed, and workflow postponed, are considered asynchronous events. And a call into code waiting for events, however, those events cannot control the execution of the workflow. Given the names, it's probably safe to assume it's understood when workflow started and completed events execute. It's less clear, however, is when workflow postponed execute. This event is raised when workflow processing is halted or paused due to workflow throttling. As mentioned previously, full trust and now sandbox custom actions can be developed and deployed as a way to extend the building blocks your users use to build more complex workflows. Sandbox custom actions do not require the use of a .action file. However, full trust custom actions do still require this file. Rather than using a .actions file, sandbox custom activities use a special action element which indicates the activity as sandbox. Like other sandbox solutions, the same rules apply to these projects as well. Sandbox solutions are deployed to the solution gallery of a site and are only available within that site. In addition, running code which attempts to navigate off the machine or access data outside of the current site is not supported and blocked. Since out-of-the-box activities are part of an assembly which is blocked from sandbox solutions, sandbox custom activities cannot be used to extend out-of-the-box activities. SharePoint 2010 now allows for a pluggable external data exchange services. An EDE service is at the core of the workflow environment. It is this component that is called by the workflow to reach out into an external system and get a response back. Creating these services is not an easy task, though, and requires a solid understanding of the SharePoint workflow environment. This feature, however, opens the door to many new workflow scenarios. So let's take a closer look at the solution which we will be developing in the next demo. We'll extend our workflow demo by adding the ability to have the workflow send a request to an external process, which will simulate asking a vendor to fulfill an order. While the vendor is processing the order, our workflow will go to sleep. Once the order has been filled, a call into the workflow object model can wake the workflow to continue processing. The workflow instances use a custom local service hosted within the workflow runtime to implement the interface, which will be used by the workflow, as well as implement the eventing mechanism necessary to pipe the response back into the workflow once the external event completes. So let's take a closer look at how we might choose to implement an EDE service by jumping right into our last demo.
Okay, in this demo we're going to take a workflow that's been modified, been actually created in Visio and then modified in SharePoint Designer. We're going to take it out of SharePoint Designer, add some additional functionality to it inside of Visual Studio 2010. So continuing on with our scenario, we have our out-of-product workflow here that, if you remember, we added a couple items, check here to make sure we have an amount on hand. If we were out of stock and our amount on hand is 0, we're going to check to see if it's discontinued. If it's not discontinued, we want to go ahead and order some more product here. This is kind of a stub right here, so we want to put our ordering activity right underneath this guy. Well, we can't really do that. We don't have such an activity here inside of SharePoint Designer, so we only want to do this within Visual Studio. So what we want to do is we want to export this workflow. So we're going to select the workflow, and then we hit this Save as Template, and this will save it to our site assets library. That we can actually use that and import that into into Visual Studio 2010. So let's go to our site assets library. And then here is our WSP that we're going to save out. Now, interestingly enough, this is a reusable workflow. So the way that you potentially would reuse this, if you go through the same process I just showed you here, now what you do is you take that WSP, email it to a buddy of yours that wants to use it on his or her site collection. They would actually then go into site settings, into the solution gallery, and then this is where they would upload the solution that they received from you that contains that workflow right here. And within that WSP is a feature that actually you can turn on. It will turn on for you. You'll turn that on, and then that workflow will then be available to you for you to associate with a list or a library. So we've exported our workflow. So now let's import that into Visual Studio. Now, a couple things about our example we're going to do. So we're going to use the External Data Exchange Services, so the EDS. And as we showed you in the previous slides, the EDS actually has a couple things we need to do. So we need to create what we call a local service, and that local service is going to implement an interface. So let's show you this. I created this iProduct ordering service. So just to kind of give you a feeling of where we are. So this is my local service that I've created here. Up here is my order fulfillment. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a web part that we actually are going to use to simulate a warehouse receiving the product and then being able to send that back into the workflow. Now, I'll show you the interface first. The first thing you have to do is define the interface. So this interface is, in my particular case, we call it iProduct Ordering Service, and then you have to give it this external data exchange attribute. This is what marks it as being uh, a, an external data exchange service. So we have two methods here. So we have actually one method here, and then we have an event handler here. So in the, and let me make this a little larger so you can see it. So in this particular case, we have as place order, and we're going to take the order ID, which is a GUID. We're going to take the name of the product, and then the amount that we want to order is our, if you think about it, our in parameter. Our out parameter, so when the order has arrived, we're going to call this order arrived event handler and raise that back to the workflow saying, hey, the order's here, here you go. And so we're going to pass in this order event args. So let's go take a look at that guy. So these arguments have to derive from a class called external data event args. And we also want to make sure we mark this class as serializable. And we also want to make sure that whenever we write this class, it is serializable, because this is actually going to get hydrated with the workflow. So we need to make sure that this is serializable, as well as whenever we go in and out of the workflow, that gets serialized and deserialized back and forth. So what we do is we need to actually take in a instance ID, because this, the class that we derive from, it actually takes as its parameter in its constructor the instance ID. So we need to make sure we honor that when we create our constructor. Let me make this a little smaller. And then we're going to take in our order ID, and then the actual quantity. So this is the actual quantity that actually was shipped to us. So we may have asked for 100 product, but then the vendor actually shipped us potentially a different amount, maybe 50, or maybe hopefully 100 that we asked for. So we'll actually have that amount as well. And then here we'll just go ahead and have these arguments. They'll be available to whoever's using this class. So that's really it. That's very simple. You think about this really as your out parameter, and this really is your in, and that's how we do the conversation with the workflow itself. Now, we have to implement our local service. A local service has to derive from this SP workflow external data exchange service. Make this a little larger. And it's also going to implement our iProduct ordering service that I just showed you. Now, a couple things. Let's go ahead and take a look at the actual the implementation here. So in place order, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate sending this order to the vendor. So I would do that right here. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually writing the order to a file. So I'll show you what that looks like real quick. So I'm just writing it just an XML file. I've got an orders. The orders is my root element, and then for each I'm just writing an order with the product and the quantity that I want, and I'm writing it to this orders.xml file in the root of the C drive. So again, this is just simulating sending this order somewhere. This could be a web service call. It could be writing this to a line of business application that knows how to do this. But this is effectively what I've done here. Let's go back to where order. So then notice I have my public event. This is the order arrived, and then this is my callback. So I'm going to get callback from the workflow runtime whenever the order has arrived. So this is where I actually build my order arguments here, and then I call the order arrived delegate, assuming it's not null. And so this is the actual callback that I'm overriding that's going to be coming back in from the runtime. So when I make that call, this is what's going to actually go back into the workflow itself and process. And I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. Now, just to show you, just for completeness, I went ahead and there's actually a couple abstract methods that have to be implemented, and I've just implemented those here on the base class. I don't really need those here. And this is a very simple example, but I still need to include those, and that's the entire class that we really need to get this going. So let's take a look at the order fulfillment. So this is a workflow. I'm sorry, this is a web part. It uses a let's look at the designer here. So this is a user control that's hosted within a web part. And so what we're going to do is we're going to select the product. So you can imagine if I'm a guy in the warehouse, I just received a shipment. It's a certain product and I received a certain amount. That's what they're doing here. They're actually we're going to select the product that we type received and the amount that we received, and then we're going to submit that. And so that is going to look like this here. So in the page on load, what I'm going to do is I'm just really going and getting the products. I'm getting the products out of the list, and this is again using if you've watched or haven't watched the link to SharePoint demo module. This is what this you won't recognize this, but really what this is linked to SharePoint. So I'm able to use link to SharePoint to actually go in, grab these products, and create what we call this product's entity, this data context, and go and grab those products out of that list. And then what I'm doing is I'm just binding them right into this products drop down. So that's what's going on there. So I encourage you to look at the links to SharePoint Ignite training when you get a chance. When I click my buttons, my submit button, what I'm going to do is just validate some of the input. So I'll validate that it's a valid amount received, and if not, I'll give them back an error message to the user. Now, what I also want to do here is I want to go ahead and grab the product based upon the product description. So in this particular case, I've got my product, make sure it's not null, and then what I want to do is get the workflow off of that product. Now, the way you do that is right down here. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. So what I want to do is, this is in this example, everything's being hosted inside of the same web application, actually the same site collection. But you can imagine that this would we'd have to do a little bit extra work here to actually go after and find the actual workflow instance that's running. But in this particular case, it's going to be relatively easy, and that is I'm just going to go grab my list, my products list here. I'm going to go ahead and get the item by ID. So now I have the actual item itself. So I have the product SP list item, and then what I'm going to do is loop through the workflows that are on this item. Now, I care about the workflows that are not completed yet because my workflow is still running. I also want to make sure that it's of the right association ID. So what I've done here is I have the name of my workflow, and I just verify that the name is of the name we want. Since I can only create one of these, in other words, only one can be running for a particular association, I'm okay in doing this. So what I do is I return my workflow. So then once I have my workflow, I can actually call this SP workflow external data exchange service raise event. And so what I'm going to do is pass the current web that's being used here. Again, I would want to pass a different web if this workflow were actually executing within a different web. I would pass the instance ID, so I need to pass the web and the instance, and then the type of, so this is my service, my local service implementation, which is the product ordering service. The method that I want to call, so order arrived, is the event I want to raise, and then I'm passing in the parameters. So remember, the first parameter is always going to be my instance ID. My second parameter is my order ID. Well, in this particular case, I just went ahead and used the instance ID for that as well, since they're both GUIDs. And then the amount received. So this is the amount that we received from the product, from the vendor. They actually shipped us. And that will actually call back into my workflow and complete the workflow. So let's go ahead and let's start the workflow. So these have both been deployed. In fact, this one is fairly easy to deploy. Let me show you what we need to do though to get this guy deployed. It's a little bit more involved. So when you deploy one of these, we actually have to write to the web.config. Actually, probably make more sense if I just showed you the web.config. So in the web.config, let's jump down here. So we need to register this workflow service. So we've got we need to register our local service with the workflow. So you notice there's a couple that are here already. You want to make sure these stay in place. This is mine. This is my assembly that's been stored in the GAC that came from that project that I just showed you, this project over here. And so what I do to register this, I just go ahead and use this feature activated and feature deactivating event receivers, and then I just go ahead and use the SP Web modification. I'm sorry, SP Web config modification, and go ahead and set the correct parameters there, and then apply the configuration to my current web application. So that will actually modify my web config for me. And then when I deactivate or this feature, I'll go ahead and remove those. So that's really the extent of what's going on there. But at this point, I need to create my third component, which is my workflow. So what we want to do is I want to create a new solution. So let's go ahead and do File. Let's do Add. We'll add a new project. In this particular case, we're going to import a reusable workflow. So this is a special project type that we're going to create. So we'll call this our out of product workflow. And it's going to be deployed as a farm solution. We really don't have any choice in this matter. And then I'm going to go find my workflow. Here it is. We just exported it before. That's our WSP. So it found our workflow, and we'll hit finish. Okay, so at this point, our solution has been imported and our workflow is available to us. And notice we have our feature already created, and then we have our workflow here. So our workflow is, we can actually open it up here. Okay, so we've got our workflow. This is the representation of what we were working on within SharePoint Designer. Notice here's our logged activity, so we want to put our custom activities right down here that we're going to create. So we want to also, I want to make sure, because our name, we've kind of hard-coded our name, we want to make sure our name is the correct name stored here. So what I've done is in the global, I actually have the name that I want it to be here. Because remember, we're checking for that name in the web part, so we want to make sure that we've got that name represented here too, since this is based upon the base template's name. Okay, so we have that. Now, what we want to do is we want to use a tool called wca.exe, and what this tool will do is we'll run this tool against our EDS service, our local service, and what we'll do is it'll generate the necessary activities for us. So let's take a look at this tool. So really what I'm doing is I'm just running WCA, and I'm running against I'm just passing in the DLL that's being generated from this that contains my service. So we'll just go ahead and run that. Let's go. So we'll jump over here, and we'll just run WCA. It'll generate our two CS files for us. I'll show you how we use those. And then what we want to do is we want to use those CS files here, so we'll add them here. Whoops. So those are our two custom activities that I'll show you how we use those in just a second. Now, before we can use those, we need to actually add a new reference here to drawing. Should actually be rendered properly on the, there we go. So notice they show up correctly. Let's also take a look at, we want to add another reference to this, another project reference here, because we actually need to reference our local service. We'll take a reference to that guy. We don't have to deploy him because remember he's already going to be deployed in the GAC, so we don't have to worry about that. And so then let's go ahead and let's open up our workflow. And we go over here to our toolbox. Actually, we want to build this. Okay. And then now our order arrived and our place order activities show up. So again, we want to put those right down in here. Okay, so we have our place order. We'll just rename that to place order. And then we'll go ahead and drop on their other one of order arrived. And then we'll rename this one to order arrived. There we go. So I'll go ahead and save this. So what we have is we have our place order and order arrive activities. Now, a couple things to note about the coloring here. Anytime that you see a green box is incoming, so data incoming into the workflow. And then when you see the blue boxes is when data is actually going out of the workflow. So it's when you're dealing with these, that's kind of what you're looking at. So place order, again, going out to our vendor. The order arrived is the event coming back into our workflow. So now we actually need to add a couple some code to this guy to get him to working. So we have some usings that we need to have there. So we have our place order method invoking. Now, what this guy's going to do is he's going to take the sender, which is our place order class that was created for us by the WCA tool, and we're going to set the order ID as being the workflow instance ID. This is again, it's a GUID. Workflow instance ID is a GUID, and it uniquely identifies our workflow that we're running, so it makes sense to use it here. The title, which is the name of the product that we're going to be using here, and then the quantity. So this is the default order amount. So if you remember back on our list, let me show you back on the list over here. We had, instead of using an initialization form or anything, we just decided, you know what we'll do, we'll just go ahead and say, well, default order amount, so whenever you run out and we want to order more product 4, we're going to order 4 of those products. So that's kind of what we're seeing. So same thing here for product 6. Whenever we run out of those guys, we're going to order 12. So that's where we're getting this value from. So that's really all we need to do for our outgoing. Go ahead and save that. Now we want to just take care of our order arrives. So this is when the event comes back in. So remember, it's going to come back into our service. Our service is going to populate the event args. It's then going to raise the order arrived, and this is where we handle that. So we want to use that here. So we take our external data event args. If you notice, you remember we have our order event args, which derived from this class. So we want to go ahead and just cast it here, so we can use that. And then what we're using, just as we did up here, we use this underscore and init params. The reason we have to use this one, it looks kind of funny, but remember this is built from a XAML workflow, so we need to, that's where our initialization parameters are stored for a XAML-based workflow. This would obviously be different if we create a workflow right from Visual Studio, but in this particular case, we're going to have to use this. And then we have our current item, so our item on hand. So we want to take the actual quantity that we received from our arguments. So this is the amount that actually came in from the warehouse recognized that we received from the vendor, and we want to set that as the new amount on hand and then hit update on the item. So what we're doing is we're basically putting the item back into stock, and then once that's complete, our workflow will be complete. So we'll go ahead and save this. And so once the order arrived is complete, we're going to go ahead and end the process. So let's see if we've done everything right. Should be able to build this. So build succeeded. So let's go ahead and deploy. It's adding the solution, activating, deployed succeeded. All right, let's go into here. Let's go to our list. So let's go ahead and associate our workflow. In this particular case, we're going to use this out-of-product workflow that came from Visual Studio. Call it the out-of-product WF. And then we want to use this, we want to start it whenever an item's created or whenever an item's changed. And we can go back to the list. So now we have our workflow set up. So let's take product 6 and let's run out of inventory on this guy. So we'll set this as 0, as the amount on hand. And you'll see our in progress, it's currently in progress and running. So let's go verify our order's been successfully sent. Yep. So you can see here, this is the last one. This is order 6. It was just written. So we've got our order ID, which really is the instance ID that we're going to be dealing with, the name of the product, and the quantity that we've asked for from the vendor. So we just keep adding to this file. So let's go over here to our order field. So imagine we've waited a few days and we were about to receive the order from the vendor. In fact, so keep in mind everything is currently executing. The workflow is actually asleep. In fact, what we can do is go ahead and just do an IS reset here. And what this does is we know that the workflow is hydrated and stored in the database. We also know that our service was actually turned off at this point, right? Because we just did an IS reset. So our service itself, if you notice, I purposely didn't store any information, so our service is actually stateless. And the reason we want it to be stateless is because of exactly what I just did. I just did an IS reset. Keep in mind that it may be 2 or 3 weeks or longer before we actually receive back confirmation of the order, or for that matter, anything that you may do here. So keep that in mind. We're actually taking a little bit of the human workflow and actually put a little bit of what you may see doing in BizTalk a little bit here, in that we're actually conversing with external applications, and those aren't necessarily something that are going to happen right away. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this, and then we're going to go ahead and imagine that I'm a guy in the warehouse. We just received a shipment, came in, I look at the pallet, it says, oh look, we've got this product number 6 here. I've got 6 of them. So what we want to do is submit that into the workflow that we've received 6. So I'll say, oh, I've got 6 of these guys. I got product 6. I've got 12 of these guys. I'll hit submit. And the order was complete. So then if I go back over here to my products, I can see now that my workflow completed on product number 6, and that I have a new amount on hand of 12. So that just shows you we've taken really a workflow that started much like this, and we're able to take that and actually extend it step by step, going through Visio to SharePoint Designer, and then of course into Visual Studio. And that completes this demo. Thanks.
In this module, we provided an overview of what's new in SharePoint 2010 workflows from various user perspectives. Using an example and several demos, we then took a workflow from Visio into SharePoint Designer and then into Visual Studio, adding additional functionality along the way. Really hope you enjoyed this module and invite you to review other Ignite presentations.